You might think your home is safe and that the streets outside are empty at night, that the shadows in your house are nothing but imagination, but sometimes reality is far stranger and far darker than anything you could imagine. Welcome to Minute 60, where we tell stories that are real, stories that keep you awake long after the lights go out. Before we begin, take a moment and think. Where are you listening from tonight? Type it in the comments. We'd love to know. And ask yourself, have you ever heard footsteps when no one was home? Felt eyes watching you in an empty room? Or experienced something that made you question reality? If so, share your story below. Some of these experiences may even appear in future videos. So, turn off the lights, settle in and listen carefully. These stories are not for the faint of heart. Alex was 28, a graphic designer who thrived on order, routines, and predictability. Even as a child, he had been meticulous, arranging books in perfect straight lines, keeping his desk spotless, and finding solace in repetition. While other kids played outside in chaotic neighborhoods, Alex preferred quiet corners, sketching designs in notebooks or building models, creating worlds where he had control. His apartment would later reflect the same careful attention to detail, everything in its place, everything measured and deliberate. Living in the city had always felt overwhelming. The constant hum of traffic, the honking, the unending construction, the shouts and laughter from neighbors. It was too much. So when Alex found a small, old apartment on the edge of town, he felt a rare sense of relief. Finally, a place where he could breathe, where he could feel safe, where the chaos of the outside world was muffled by walls thick with age. The building itself was unremarkable, yet there was something quietly compelling about it. From the outside, faded brick and peeling paint suggested years of use, and a swinging sign creaked with every gust of wind. The narrow stairway groaned beneath each step, as though complaining under weight. Inside, however, it was quiet. The hallway was dimly lit by a single flickering bulb, the faint smell of old wood and dust lingering in the air. Alex felt a strange thrill walking through it, the kind that comes with a first moment of privacy and independence. His apartment was modest, a small living room, a bedroom barely large enough for his bed and desk, and a tiny kitchen with cracked tiles. It was far from luxurious, but it felt like his own world. Milo, his tabby cat, explored cautiously, sniffing every corner, circling the living room table, and curling into the sunlit patches on the floor. Milo's alert movements gave Alex a sense of security. If the cat felt at ease, perhaps he could too. Mr. Harris, the landlord, was polite, reserved, and slightly stiff in manner. "Only one other tenant," he mentioned. "Quiet, keeps to himself." Alex nodded, feeling the weight of privacy he'd longed for. Carrying boxes up the narrow staircase, he felt the wood protest beneath each footfall, echoing through the hallway. Stepping into the apartment, he felt a strange calm, almost as if the building exhaled quietly, acknowledging him. The first few nights passed without incident. Alex unpacked slowly, placing items with precision. Books on shelves, kitchen utensils in their proper drawers, desk tools aligned perfectly. Milo, ever watchful, jumped onto the sofa, curling into a tight, purring ball. Alex appreciated the subtle noises of the apartment, the gentle hum of the radiator, the distant echo of traffic muffled by the thick walls, the soft rustle of curtains moved by a breeze slipping through the slightly open window. Even Milo seemed content, observing shadows lazily dancing on the walls. Yet, subtle anomalies began creeping into his life. A bag left on the coffee table would appear slightly shifted in the morning. Milo sometimes hissed at corners where nothing was visible. Lamps occasionally tilted, though he had placed them straight. Alex rationalized each event as coincidence, fatigue, imagination, or Milo's curiosity. But the feeling of being watched, once faint, started to grow heavier, like a weight pressing into the edges of his mind. The apartment, his sanctuary, began to feel alive. One Thursday night, unease became undeniable. Alex was reading on the sofa, the lamp casting a warm glow across the living room. A subtle shuffle echoed through the hallway outside his bedroom door. He froze. The sound stopped. Perhaps Milo had moved. Perhaps the building itself settled under its age. Then moments later, the steps returned. Slow, deliberate, and impossible to ignore. Alex's pulse quickened. Milo's fur bristled, ears flat, eyes wide and fixed on the hallway. That night, Alex realized his apartment had changed. It was no longer just walls, floorboards, and furniture. It had become a space that observed. He could feel it in the slight draft brushing his face, in the floorboards that groaned under imaginary weight, in the shadows that stretched in unnatural ways across the room. The apartment had a rhythm, and he was now part of it. Imagine the same. A space that seems aware of your presence, where every corner holds a whisper of the unknown. It's the kind of unease you feel in silence, when nothing seems wrong, yet everything feels off. The following days, Alex attempted normal routines. He went to work, returned home, and tried to convince himself that everything was ordinary. Yet every evening, subtle disturbances returned. A chair slightly moved, a drawer not entirely closed, the faint sensation of eyes watching from empty rooms. Milo's instincts were a constant reminder. His cat refused to enter the hallway for long stretches, hissing at invisible presences and retreating under the sofa. Alex began keeping notes. He detailed each minor incident, the exact time objects were displaced, Milo's reactions, the faint noises he heard when the apartment seemed otherwise still. He discovered a pattern. Most events occurred late at night, between 11:30 p.m. and 3:30 a.m., precise in their timing. The realization unsettled him further. Whatever or whoever was present, it was patient, deliberate, and aware. That Thursday night, determination overcame fear. Alex sat on the sofa, Milo at his feet, and listened. The apartment was still. A subtle draft passed through the window. The floorboards groaned faintly. Then unmistakable, deliberate footsteps echoed down the hallway. Milo's tail lashed violently. Alex's stomach knotted. He whispered, almost to himself, "Who's there?" The footsteps paused, then retreated, leaving silence heavy and lingering in their wake. The apartment had made its presence known. And Alex understood with a creeping certainty that this was only the beginning. Whatever occupied these walls, human memory, lingering energy, or something else entirely, it had claimed this space, and he was now part of its world. You might feel it too, that prickling awareness that something unseen moves quietly in the spaces around you. Perhaps it watches without harm, yet it is impossible to ignore. That night, Alex tried to sleep, but every small noise amplified into suspicion. The creak of a floorboard became a signal, the whisper of wind, a warning. Milo's movements punctuated every moment, his instincts sharper than Alex's own perception. By morning, Alex had concluded one unsettling truth. This apartment was no longer merely a living space. It was alive in ways he could not understand, patient and deliberate, waiting for him to fully realize it. From that night forward, each day and night carried a tension that Alex could not shake. His sanctuary had become a stage for subtle observation, a place where shadows and silence carried meaning. And somewhere within, unseen, a presence lingered, patient, intelligent, and impossibly aware. For Alex, life in the apartment had changed. The familiar rhythm of day and night became a careful dance of observation. Sleep, once a refuge, became a study in vigilance. Milo remained ever alert, a companion and a warning system, and Alex learned to read the subtle signals that the cat provided. The apartment had taught him that true unease comes not from sudden, violent events, but from patient, unseen presences that insist on being noticed, yet remain just out of reach. The days following Alex's first unsettling night passed in a tense haze. He tried to maintain normal routines, work, groceries, meals, as if the disturbances could be ignored. Yet each evening, the apartment seemed different. The quiet was heavier, almost anticipatory. Objects that had been untouched during the day appeared subtly moved. A book on the shelf tilted slightly, a mug was a few inches from its usual place. Milo's behavior became an unspoken alarm system. The cat avoided certain corners of the living room, ears twitching, fur rising, eyes wide, as if tracking invisible movements. Alex tried to rationalize it. Perhaps he had misplaced items in his rush to unpack. Perhaps Milo had knocked things over. Perhaps the floorboards shifted with temperature and humidity. But the consistency, the subtle repetition, suggested something more deliberate. He began keeping a journal, noting every incident with exact times, the positions of objects, and Milo's reactions. Slowly a pattern emerged. These disturbances almost always occurred late at night, around 11:30 p.m., 1:47 a.m., 3:15 a.m., precise and deliberate. One evening, Alex returned home early, hoping to catch a sign of what was happening. Milo trailed him cautiously, pausing mid-step to sniff the air. Alex walked through the apartment, checking doors, windows, and corners. Everything seemed normal. The living room, kitchen, and bedroom were in order. Yet a subtle unease lingered in the corners of his vision, in the way the shadows stretched longer than they should, in the slight draft brushing across his neck. He sat on the sofa, notebook open, and began documenting again. Milo curled beside him, his tail twitching. Time stretched slowly, the dim glow of the lamp casting long shadows on the walls. And then he heard it. A faint shuffle from the hallway outside the bedroom. Heart hammering, Alex froze. Milo hissed, back arched, crouched low on the carpet. The shuffle paused. The apartment returned to its quiet state. Alex whispered to Milo, "It's okay. It's okay." But the reassurance felt hollow. Something moved here, he realized, something that was patient, deliberate, and aware of him. The fear was subtle, creeping slowly into his mind. It wasn't terror in a flash, it was a sustained, pervasive unease that made him hyper-aware of every sound, every shadow, every minor displacement of objects. Determined to capture evidence, Alex set up his phone to record overnight. He positioned it to cover the hallway and living room. Milo slept on the sofa, tail twitching even in slumber. At 2:37 a.m., the phone recorded a shadow passing along the hallway. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, yet clearly out of sync with any natural movement. Milo bolted, hissing at the space where nothing appeared to exist. Alex replayed the footage repeatedly. There was no one, no visible figure. And yet, something had moved, something deliberate. He spent the next day analyzing the video, watching frame by frame. The shadow never approached the camera. It never caused harm. It simply existed, moving through the apartment as though testing the space, or perhaps studying him. The realization brought a chilling clarity. This presence did not need to threaten him. Its patience, precision, and awareness were far more unsettling than any sudden act of violence. Consider for a moment, something might move unseen in your own space, deliberate and patient, not to harm, but merely to exist. How would that change your perception of safety? That night, Alex attempted to maintain a semblance of normalcy. He dimmed the lights, kept Milo close, and sat reading, attempting to focus on something mundane. But the apartment resisted comfort. A lamp he had not touched tilted slightly. The shadows in the hallway elongated, forming shapes that made his pulse quicken. He tried to shake off the tension, but Milo's tail flicked nervously. Every instinct told him that the apartment was aware, and that awareness extended beyond what Alex could see. Sleep, once a refuge, became impossible. Alex lay awake, listening intently to every creak, every whisper of wind, every subtle shift in shadows. Milo's presence was a comforting constant, yet even the cat seemed on edge. The subtle, patient disturbances were no longer isolated. They were part of a rhythm, a pattern that Alex had not fully deciphered, but felt in every nerve of his body. One particularly quiet night, Alex decided to confront the unknown in a small way. He moved slowly through the apartment, checking every corner, talking aloud to Milo to mask his own fear. The living room was in order, the bedroom untouched, the kitchen silent. Yet, as he turned back to the sofa, he noticed something impossible. The coffee table, which he had straightened moments earlier, was slightly shifted, as if moved deliberately by unseen hands. Milo hissed from the corner. Alex froze, realizing he could no longer ignore what was happening. There was no malice in the movements, nothing violent, no broken objects, no threats. And that, Alex realized, was far more terrifying. The apartment had become a place where he was observed, studied, and understood. Its awareness was patient, precise, and deliberate. Over the following days, Alex adapted. He moved carefully through the apartment, mindful of shadows and corners. Milo's behavior guided him, signaling areas of potential disturbance. He became attuned to every sound, the subtle groan of the floorboards, the faint whisper of wind brushing curtains, the distant hum of the city outside. The apartment's life was quiet, almost imperceptible, but undeniably present. His journal became a lifeline. Every subtle movement, every shift in light, every sound was recorded. The pattern was undeniable. Most events occurred at precise times. The presence was aware, observing, waiting. Alex learned to coexist, to move with awareness rather than fear, to accept that some things might never be understood. You might imagine being in Alex's place, a home that seems to breathe with unseen life, where silence carries meaning and shadows move with intent. The ordinary becomes uncanny, and the familiar uncertain. Weeks passed, and Alex found himself constantly alert, yet strangely attuned. He learned to recognize the apartment's subtle rhythms, when it shifted, when it moved, when it observed. Sleep was brief and cautious. Milo became both guide and companion, alert to the unseen in ways Alex could not fully interpret. The apartment had changed, Alex had changed, and the quiet, patient presence had become a permanent part of his world, unthreatening, yet profoundly unsettling. The first strange incidents were only the beginning. The apartment had revealed itself slowly, deliberately, insisting on being noticed. And Alex knew that as long as he remained there, he would continue to observe, record, and live alongside something patient, precise, and impossibly aware. Weeks into his uneasy coexistence with the apartment, Alex had grown hyper-aware of every creak, every draft, every flicker of shadow. The minor disturbances had become consistent, predictable in their timing, and deliberate in their placement. Lamps tilted slightly, books shifted on shelves, and Milo's fur would bristle at corners of the room where nothing visible existed. The presence had made itself known quietly, yet its patient observation weighed heavily on Alex's mind. By the middle of the second week, he realized he could no longer ignore it. The shadows and movements were not random. The apartment had a rhythm, a life of its own, and he was now part of it. Each night, he grew increasingly aware of the subtle signals. The soft groan of the floorboards, the faint whisper of wind brushing against the curtains, the distant hum of the city filtered through thick brick walls. These sounds were no longer background noise, they were markers, indicators of a presence that watched. Determined to understand, Alex decided to confront the unknown in a small, controlled way. He spent the afternoon preparing, cameras positioned in the hallway, the living room, and the bedroom. Milo remained nearby, his amber eyes tracking every movement. Alex paced the apartment slowly, checking doors, corners, and windows. Everything appeared ordinary. Too ordinary, in fact. And that was when he felt it. The subtle shift in air, the almost imperceptible pressure of being observed. That evening, he sat on the sofa, camera ready, notebook open. Milo curled at his feet, alert and tense. Hours passed with only the quiet hum of the radiator and the occasional sigh of wind outside. Alex kept reminding himself, patience, observation, evidence. He could not allow fear to cloud judgment. And yet, a knot of unease had settled deep in his chest. At precisely 2:14 a.m., it happened. Footsteps, deliberate, slow, echoing faintly in the hallway, approached the bedroom door. Milo hissed violently, arching his back. Alex froze, heart hammering, eyes fixed on the shadows beyond the sofa. The footsteps stopped. Silence filled the room, but it was a silence charged with intent. A faint whisper followed, almost too soft to comprehend. Alex. His breath caught. The word, if it could be called that, was deliberate. It held awareness. It held knowledge of him. He could not see anyone. There was no figure, no physical presence. And yet the apartment had communicated directly, subtly, undeniably. Imagine this for a moment, being aware of something observing you, precise, patient, yet unseen. How would you feel in your own home, in your sanctuary? Alex's hands trembled slightly as he approached the hallway. The air was heavier here, as if the presence itself pressed upon him. Shadows stretched unnaturally along the walls, pooling in corners where no light should fall. Milo stayed low, growling softly. The room felt alive, responsive to every movement, every breath. He turned to Mr. Harris, the landlord, hoping to gain some insight into the apartment's history. Perhaps Daniel, the previous tenant, had left something behind. Perhaps there was a rational explanation. But Mr. Harris only hesitated, unease flickering across his face. Daniel. He moved out months ago. There's nothing left. His voice trailed off, and Alex sensed he had uncovered something he was not meant to know. That night, Alex stayed awake, cameras running, Milo at his side. The apartment seemed to breathe around him, each creak and shadow measured and deliberate. At exactly 3:02 a.m., the footsteps returned, slow, methodical, deliberate. Milo hissed at the corner near the hallway. Alex held his breath. The shadows moved as if alive, stretching along the walls, forming shapes that seemed almost purposeful. He tried to speak aloud, reasoning with the apartment, with whatever unseen presence lurked within. "I'm not here to harm you. I'm only observing." Silence answered him, but it was a silence thick with intelligence. The presence was aware, deliberate, patient, and it was studying him as much as he was. Over the next several nights, Alex became increasingly aware of patterns. The apartment communicated in subtle ways, the placement of objects, the direction of shadows, the intensity of creaks. Each night he moved more cautiously, learning to navigate this living space as if it were a partner in a silent dialogue. Milo guided him, reacting instinctively to shifts and shadows that Alex could not always perceive. There was no malice, no sudden threats, no broken items. And that was what made it terrifying. The apartment, or whatever resided within it, existed on its own terms. It observed patiently, aware of Alex's routines, his fears, his reactions. The tension was constant, unrelenting, subtle, yet impossible to ignore. You might imagine yourself in Alex's place, sharing your home with something that observes quietly, waits patiently, and communicates without words. The ordinary becomes uncanny, familiar spaces feel alien, and even your own instincts are tested. One night, Alex decided to test the apartment further. He left his bedroom, walking slowly toward the living room, with the lights off. Milo trailed closely. Every floorboard groan echoed unnaturally. Shadows twisted in corners, forming shapes that seemed intentional. The coffee table, which he had straightened moments earlier, was slightly shifted. Lamps tilted subtly. The evidence was undeniable. The apartment moved, observed, and responded. Alex realized he had entered a silent partnership. The presence was patient, deliberate, and intelligent. It did not seek to harm, yet its awareness alone created tension impossible to ignore. Sleep was brief, cautious, and interrupted. His days became measured, spent observing patterns and recording anomalies. He had learned to coexist, to anticipate, to respect the unknown within his home. The realization was clear. The apartment was not merely a space. It was alive in a subtle, deliberate way. It observed patterns, waited, and perhaps even learned. Alex understood that his life would forever be intertwined with this quiet intelligence, patient, precise, and profoundly aware. Milo's behavior guided him, but no ordinary logic explained the phenomena. Every sound, shadow, and draft carried meaning. Alex accepted that he could not fully understand. He could only coexist, cautiously, respectfully, and observantly. And so, Alex learned the truth about his home. That horror is not always sudden or violent. Sometimes it is subtle, patient, intelligent. It exists quietly, deliberately, observing without interruption, waiting for acknowledgement. And in its presence one must remain vigilant, aware, and above all, patient. Morning sunlight filtered weakly through the apartment curtains, casting long, slanting shadows across the walls. Alex sat on the sofa, Milo curled tightly beside him, purring softly. The apartment was quiet, but this quiet carried weight, a patient, lingering awareness that seemed to hum beneath the floorboards and through the walls. Sleep had been shallow, interrupted, but the day demanded movement. Alex rose carefully, mindful of every creak and whisper of air, guiding Milo as he moved through the apartment. Over the weeks, he had learned to interpret subtle signals, the way shadows shifted across the walls, the faint pressure of air near the hallway, Milo's instinctive reactions. It was not overtly threatening. It did not speak, attack, or break anything. And yet its presence was undeniable. Alex had come to recognize a rhythm, an intelligence behind the disturbances, one that watched him, studied him, and waited. His life had changed in ways both small and profound. Where once he had moved through the apartment unconsciously, now every step was deliberate, measured. Lamps and furniture were placed with precision, aware of how subtle shifts could trigger responses. He recorded movements, noted patterns, and relied on Milo's instincts to gauge the apartment's awareness. It was a careful dance, one that required patience, observation, and constant attention. Alex sometimes caught himself staring at corners of the room where shadows pooled unnaturally. The sunlight, though reassuring during the day, revealed the apartment's quirks. Floorboards warped, walls cracked in patterns that seemed almost deliberate. Each subtle imperfection added to the sense that the apartment had a memory, a consciousness beyond his comprehension. Imagine yourself in Alex's shoes, a home that observes, waits, and responds silently. how would your perception of safety change? What would it feel like to share your space with an intelligence that never sleeps? Over time, Alex's fear transformed into cautious respect. He no longer panicked at every movement or shadow. Instead, he learned to coexist. He adjusted routines, anticipating subtle cues and responding accordingly. Milo remained a constant guide, alert to movements Alex could not always perceive. Together, they navigated the apartment with a new understanding, a tacit acknowledgement of the unseen presence. Alex's journals, once a record of fear and confusion, became a map of coexistence. He documented patterns, times, and reactions. Through this process, he realized that horror does not always manifest through overt violence. Sometimes it exists quietly, patiently, deliberately, a presence that tests boundaries, observes behaviors, and insists on recognition. Nights were still tense. Sleep remained a fragile state, easily disrupted by the faintest sound or movement. Yet Alex discovered that awareness could transform fear into adaptation. He moved deliberately through the apartment, noting subtle changes in shadows, air currents, and object placement. Milo's instincts guided him, alerting him to disturbances before they escalated. In this way, Alex learned to coexist, not in peace, but in a cautious equilibrium with the apartment's patient intelligence. As days turned into weeks, he noticed something extraordinary. The disturbances had become less startling, almost predictable. Lamps tilted slowly over hours, shadows stretched along familiar patterns, and the subtle hum of the apartment seemed to follow a rhythm. It was as though the presence had acknowledged him, adapting its behavior to his awareness. The apartment, once a source of relentless tension, had become a teacher of patience, observation, and careful coexistence. Alex often reflected on the nature of fear. He realized that horror is not always sudden or violent. It can be subtle, intelligent, and patient, existing in the spaces between light and shadow, sound and silence. The apartment had taught him this lesson in ways he could not have imagined. Its presence was a constant reminder that awareness, observation, and adaptation were essential for coexistence with forces beyond comprehension. He sometimes caught himself wondering whether the presence had always been part of the building, existing quietly, waiting for someone like him, observant, patient, and aware, to notice. Perhaps it had tested other tenants, waiting for someone who could understand its rhythm. Or perhaps it had existed simply to observe, learning quietly from the lives of those who entered its domain. Consider this. Perhaps there are spaces you occupy that carry unseen awareness, shadows that move with intent, subtle pressures in the air. What would you do if you realized your home itself was observing, patiently, deliberately, waiting for you to notice? Life in the apartment became a study in observation. Alex moved deliberately, placing objects with care, adjusting routines and documenting patterns. He no longer expected to fully understand the presence. He accepted it as a part of his environment, an intelligent, patient force that shaped his perception of reality. Milo's instincts remained an essential guide, signaling disturbances invisible to human senses. Together, they navigated a delicate coexistence with something beyond ordinary comprehension. Alex wrote in his journal, "I have learned patience, I have learned to observe. The apartment is neither friend nor enemy. It simply exists, aware, intelligent, patient. I am part of its rhythm now, and it is part of mine. I do not fully understand, but I respect it. And in respect, I have found a cautious equilibrium." The apartment had transformed Alex. What had begun as fear became adaptation, vigilance, and awareness. Sleep remained brief, tension lingered, but he was no longer paralyzed by anxiety. He understood that horror often manifests in subtle ways, patient, precise, and intelligent. And perhaps that is far more terrifying than anything sudden or violent could ever be. In the stillness of the night, with Milo curled against his chest and the faint wind whispering through the apartment, Alex reflected on what he had learned. True horror does not always announce itself. It exists quietly, deliberately, observing those who dwell within its space. It tests, it waits, and it insists on acknowledgement. And sometimes it teaches lessons that are impossible to forget. Ambient cue, long pause 5 to 6 seconds, soft wind, distant hum fades. Alex realized that he would carry this awareness for the rest of his life. The apartment had taught him vigilance, patience, and respect for the unseen. Horror was not something to be defeated or outrun. It was something to acknowledge, to coexist with, to adapt around. And in that understanding, Alex discovered a strange peace. Fragile, cautious, but real. Milo purred softly, the constant and familiar presence in a world that had become anything but ordinary. And Alex understood one final truth. Some horrors do not vanish. They wait quietly, intelligently, patiently, and we can only learn to live alongside them, aware, respectful, and alert. The morning sunlight no longer felt entirely comforting in Alex's apartment. Shadows lingered longer than they should, and the quiet carried the weight of unseen eyes. Milo stretched lazily beside him, but Alex's gaze remained fixed on the corners of the room. Anticipating, observing, aware, the apartment had changed him, teaching patience, vigilance, and the subtle tension that comes from sharing space with the unknown. And yet, even as he tried to move on, he knew that this was only one story among many. The world is full of places, people, and moments where the ordinary becomes extraordinary, where fear and curiosity intertwine, quietly, invisibly. What Alex experienced could be just the beginning. As you listen tonight, perhaps in the quiet of your own home, consider this. What stories might be unfolding around you, unnoticed, patient, and deliberate? Sometimes the most unsettling tales are not the ones that scream, but the ones that whisper. Now let us step carefully into another tale, another true horror that crept into someone's life unexpectedly. A story where the line between reality and the unknown blurs, and ordinary spaces become anything but safe. Keep your ears alert, your senses open, and remember, some presences, patient and unseen, do not rest. This next story begins in a quiet neighborhood, much like any other. But as you will soon hear, quiet does not always mean safe. The shadows linger, the air carries unspoken warnings, and those who pay attention may notice what others do not. Emma had always preferred solitude. At 32, she worked from home as a freelance illustrator, spending long hours at her desk, sketching landscapes and characters that lived only on paper. Her apartment, on the 3rd floor of a mid-century building, was tidy, quiet, and uncluttered. A sanctuary where she could control her environment completely. Routine was her comfort. Morning coffee by the window, sketching until noon, lunch, a walk through the quiet streets, then back to her drawings in the late afternoon. Her neighbours were polite but distant, everyone going about their own lives behind curtained windows. Emma liked it that way. Privacy mattered more than companionship, and she had grown accustomed to the subtle rhythms of her apartment. The old wooden floors groaned occasionally, the radiator hummed softly, and the occasional gust of wind rattled the windows, comforting reminders that the apartment, though old, was alive in ordinary ways. It was on a Tuesday evening that the first unsettling occurrence happened. Emma had been finishing a series of sketches when she noticed it, the faint sound of a door closing, not her own, but the apartment door. She froze. She lived alone. Her heart skipped a beat. Milo, her neighbor's cat who often wandered the hallway, could not have reached her apartment without her noticing. Shaking her head, she tried to rationalize it. Perhaps it was the neighbor returning briefly and closing their door, or a draft causing the old latch to fall. But the sound had a deliberate quality, a faint pressure in the air that felt like acknowledgement, as if the apartment itself had shifted in response. Emma's first instinct was to check every corner of the apartment. She moved methodically, opening closets, looking behind doors, examining windows. Nothing. Everything was in place. And yet she could not shake the feeling that she was being observed, not by a person, but by something unseen. Shadows seemed to linger longer than usual. The faint rustle of air felt deliberate. The soft creak of the floor sounded as if someone had stepped lightly across it moments before she noticed. That night, she attempted sleep, drawing the curtains tightly and keeping a low lamp on beside her bed. Yet every sound, the radiator sighing, a distant traffic hum, a floorboard groan, became amplified in her mind. Sleep arrived only in short, anxious fits, broken by the persistent sense that she was not alone. Imagine your own home in the quiet of night. Every sound, every shift in air becomes significant. How aware would you become if you knew something was observing you, patient, deliberate, and unseen? Over the next few days, the disturbances increased in subtle ways. Sketchbooks would be slightly moved. Pencils shifted from their usual positions. Occasionally, the sound of faint footsteps echoed down the hall outside her door. At first, Emma questioned herself. Fatigue? Imagination? But the consistency was unnerving. The events followed a quiet, deliberate rhythm, almost as if someone, or something, was testing her awareness, gauging her reactions. Emma began documenting the incidents in a journal. She noted times, positions of objects, sounds, and even the way shadows stretched in corners. Patterns began to emerge. The most notable activity occurred late at night, between 11 p.m. and 3 a.m. The quiet disturbances were not chaotic, they were calculated. Someone or something was observing her carefully, waiting for acknowledgement. One particularly cold Thursday, the air seemed heavier than usual. Emma was finishing a sketch of a cityscape when she noticed a subtle movement in her peripheral vision, a shadow passing just beyond the living room window. She blinked. Nothing. Yet the chill in her spine remained. Milo, her tabby cat, who usually slept quietly on the sofa, bolted upright, ears flat, tail flicking nervously. Emma's hands shook slightly as she whispered to Milo, "It's okay. It's okay." But reassurance felt hollow. The apartment had made its presence undeniable. The shadow, whether real or imagined, had been deliberate. The soft hum of the radiator, the creak of the floor, the shifting shadows, all combined into a patient, unnerving awareness that could not be ignored. Determined to gather evidence, Emma set up her phone and a small camera in the living room and hallway. She recorded the next few nights diligently. At 2:47 a.m., the footage captured a shadow passing through the hallway, faint, deliberate, and impossible to attribute to herself or any neighbor. Milo reacted instantly, hissing and retreating under the sofa. The apartment remained otherwise undisturbed. No doors opened, no objects fell. And yet the presence was unmistakable, patient, precise, and aware. Emma reviewed the recordings obsessively. Frame by frame, she noted the shadow's movement. It never approached the camera, never caused destruction. It existed quietly, observing. And in its quiet, it communicated intent, a deliberate acknowledgement of her presence in its domain. Perhaps you have felt something similar. The sensation of being watched without cause, of an unseen intelligence that exists alongside you, patient, deliberate, and persistent. How would that change the way you perceive your own home? Emma's days became measured, cautious. She learned to anticipate the presence, subtle adjustments in objects, gentle observation of shadows, listening for floorboard creaks, monitoring air currents. Milo's instincts guided her through the uncertainty, signaling disturbances before they became apparent to human senses. Sleep remained fragile, but her awareness had sharpened, transforming fear into cautious vigilance. The apartment, once a sanctuary, had become a partner in a delicate dance of observation and adaptation. Emma understood one undeniable truth: the uninvited presence did not seek to harm. Its intelligence was subtle, patient, and deliberate. A quiet, persistent reminder that some forces in life are better respected than confronted. As she prepared to face the next night, camera ready, lights dimmed, and Milo close at hand, Emma realized that the ordinary world could conceal extraordinary phenomena. The mundane, a quiet apartment, an ordinary hallway, shadows stretching under a lamp, could hide awareness far beyond human understanding. And as she lay down, alert but cautious, she knew this was only the beginning of a series of events that would test her perception, patience, and courage. The nights grew longer, heavier, and quieter than usual. Emma had become hyper-aware of every detail in her apartment, every sound, every flicker of shadow. Footsteps echoed softly in the hallway, even when no one was there. Books, pencils, and sketchpads shifted imperceptibly, yet repeatedly, as though an unseen hand was arranging them just out of reach. Milo, her vigilant tabby, became the constant indicator of the apartment's moods. His ears flicked, tail lashed, and occasional hissing reminded Emma that there was something present she could neither see nor fully comprehend. One night, around 1:23 a.m., she awoke to a faint rustle near the bedroom door. The air felt heavier, the faint scent of something metallic, unplaceable. Milo bolted upright from the foot of the bed, his fur bristling. Emma held her breath, straining to hear beyond the hum of the radiator and the distant traffic below. The rustle stopped. Silence returned, but a silence charged with intent. Something had moved. Something had been watching. Emma's heart pounded, but curiosity overcame panic. She slipped from the bed, careful not to disturb Milo, and walked slowly toward the living room. The air felt denser with each step. Shadows seemed to pool in corners, stretching unnaturally, and the faint creak of floorboards echoed far more deliberately than the weight of her own footsteps should have caused. She approached the hallway, feeling a chill crawl up her spine. The apartment, she realized, was no longer merely a setting. It was an active participant. Each movement, each sound seemed deliberate, calculated and measured. And yet it was subtle, nothing overtly violent, no doors slamming, no objects crashing. The terror was in the awareness that the apartment itself was alive in ways she could not explain, and that she was under constant observation. Think of it for a moment. A space that watches you quietly, moves subtly, tests your awareness, and refuses to reveal itself completely. How would you adjust your behavior? How would your perception of safety change? Determined to gather more evidence, Emma set up cameras in the living room, hallway, and bedroom. Milo remained a constant companion, his instincts far sharper than her own. Night after night, the recordings revealed subtle movements, shadows flickering, objects shifting ever so slightly, floorboards groaning without visible cause. The most unnerving moments were when the disturbances mirrored her own movements, as if the apartment were aware of her attention, responding in turn. At 2:58 a.m., the apartment's awareness became undeniable. A sketchbook she had placed carefully on the desk moments earlier slid slightly to the side as if nudged by invisible fingers. Milo bolted and hissed at the far corner of the room. Emma froze. The air seemed heavier there, charged with intent. She whispered, almost to herself, "Who's there?" Silence answered, yet the presence was tangible. Emma tried to rationalize the events, searching for logical explanations: a draft, a neighbor's cat, the settling of an old building. But the consistency, precision, and timing of the disturbances defied logic. They occurred mostly between 11 p.m. and 3 a.m., precise in duration, subtle yet deliberate. The apartment had become a silent, watchful companion, testing boundaries without aggression, observing with intelligence she could not fully comprehend. Sleep became almost impossible. Each creak, rustle, and shadow drew her attention immediately. She moved cautiously through the apartment, adjusting objects to anticipate disturbances, monitoring Milo's reactions, and noting every subtle anomaly in her journal. The fear had transformed into a careful, tense awareness, a kind of coexisting vigilance with a presence she could not see, yet could feel in every corner, every shadow, every breath of air. One night, as she sketched by the dim lamp, she noticed something that caused her stomach to knot. A pencil she had placed vertically in a jar toppled over, slowly, deliberately, despite no one touching it. Milo hissed and bolted under the desk, ears flat. Emma froze, heart hammering. It was as if the apartment itself had acknowledged her activity, responding subtly, almost tauntingly. That night, she stayed awake until dawn, cameras running, Milo vigilant at her side. The apartment's presence had made itself unmistakably known. It did not harm, but it observed, tested, and waited. Its intelligence was subtle yet undeniable, a quiet awareness that permeated every inch of her living space. Imagine a home that watches, that responds to your awareness, that exists quietly alongside you, testing your perception without ever revealing itself completely. How would that change the way you inhabit your own spaces? Days turned into a week of cautious coexistence. Emma adapted her routines, keeping lights low, leaving objects intentionally in places that might prompt subtle responses, monitoring shadows, and tracking Milo's instinctive cues. She discovered that the disturbances followed subtle patterns, almost like communication, an unspoken dialogue with a presence that remained unseen but undeniably aware. On the 7th night, she made a deliberate choice. Instead of avoiding the disturbances, she confronted them in her own way. Moving slowly through the apartment, speaking softly to Milo, she acknowledged the presence aloud. "I see you," she whispered. "I know you are here. I will not be afraid." For hours, nothing happened. Yet the apartment felt different, alive, aware, and patient. It had recognized her acknowledgement, responding not with malice, but with subtle patience. Over time, Emma realized an unsettling truth. True horror is not always violent. It can be quiet, intelligent, deliberate, existing in subtle movements and unseen awareness. The apartment was no longer a simple space. It had become a living entity, testing her perception, teaching her vigilance, and demanding awareness. Milo remained her guide, alerting her to changes she could not perceive. Together they navigated a fragile coexistence with a presence that refused to be ignored. By the end of the section, Emma had learned a delicate equilibrium. Sleep was still brief, tension still present, but she had found a way to coexist, to observe, and to adapt. The apartment had made itself known, and she had acknowledged it. A silent partnership of vigilance, awareness, and subtle understanding. And yet, Emma knew this was only the beginning. The uninvited guest had made its presence undeniable, and the subtle disturbances were far from over. Patience, observation, and careful attention would be required in the nights to come. A reminder that sometimes the most terrifying entities are those that do not need to strike, but simply exist. intelligent, patient, and unseen. The nights had grown tense, suffused with an almost unbearable awareness. Emma had become attuned to every creak, every subtle shift in the apartment. Milo's presence remained her anchor, the feline guide who reacted instinctively to movements unseen. Each night, Emma recorded disturbances with her camera, noting subtle patterns in shadows, floorboards, and objects. The presence had revealed itself, patient, deliberate, and observant. One night at 2:16 a.m., the apartment seemed heavier, charged with anticipation. Emma sat at her desk, sketchbook open, pencils in careful alignment. Milo lay curled at her feet, tail twitching nervously. The air felt thicker, pressing lightly on her skin, as if the space itself had grown conscious of her attention. Then she heard it, a faint whisper, almost imperceptible, brushing her ear. "Emma!" Her heart thudded violently. She froze. Milo bolted upright, ears flat, tail bristling. The whisper had been deliberate, aware, impossible to dismiss as imagination. The apartment was no longer a passive observer. It had acknowledged her, speaking in the softest of tones, precise, calculated, and deliberate. Imagine being in her place, hearing a voice that seems real but unseen, a presence aware of your attention, testing the boundaries of your reality. How would you respond? Emma's first instinct was to check every corner. She moved slowly through the apartment, careful not to make sudden movements, whispering softly to Milo. The air felt heavier near the hallway, subtle shadows pooling unnaturally in the corners. Her sketchbook had shifted slightly. A pencil slid out of alignment. These small, deliberate movements were the apartment's way of communicating, a silent acknowledgement of her presence and observation. She tried to rationalize it, as always, fatigue, imagination, the natural quirks of an old building. But the precision and timing of each disturbance, the soft whispers, the sliding objects, Milo's reactions, defied logic. The apartment had become an intelligent, aware entity, observing her in ways she could not fully comprehend. Determined to confront the presence in a controlled way, Emma set up multiple cameras throughout the apartment. She dimmed the lights, leaving only a small lamp on her desk, and positioned herself near the center of the living room. Milo remained at her side, ears twitching, tail flicking nervously. Hours passed. Footsteps echoed faintly in the hallway outside her bedroom door. Shadows shifted along the walls, objects she had carefully placed, pencils, sketchbooks, a small vase, moved subtly, almost imperceptibly. Each time, Milo reacted instantly, growling softly, signaling disturbances Emma could not fully perceive. At precisely 3:12 a.m., the apartment's awareness became undeniable. A chair, which Emma had positioned near her desk moments earlier, tipped slightly forward, as if nudged by invisible fingers. Milo hissed and bolted under the desk, eyes fixed on a corner of the room where nothing visible existed. Emma froze. The air itself seemed to thrum, thick with intent. She whispered aloud, "I see you. I know you are here. I am not afraid." For a long moment, silence returned. Then she felt it. A subtle shift in pressure, a slight movement of air brushing past her face. The apartment had responded. It was deliberate. It was aware. It had acknowledged her words, testing her perception, measuring her courage, and insisting on recognition. Imagine the tension of knowing you are being observed, the silent acknowledgement of your presence, and the subtle movements that signal intelligence beyond your understanding. How would you reconcile fear with curiosity in such a moment? Over the following nights, the disturbances grew more deliberate. Objects shifted in alignment with her attention. Shadows moved in synchrony with her gaze. The whispers, faint and deliberate, became part of the rhythm, subtle signals that the apartment existed as a conscious, aware entity. Milo remained the vigilant guide, alerting Emma to every shift, every subtle pressure. every unseen presence. One night, Emma decided to push the boundaries. She placed her sketchbook in the center of the living room, pencils arranged meticulously around it, and left the room entirely, closing the door behind her. Milo trailed cautiously. Hours later, she returned to find the pencils aligned differently, the sketchbook slightly angled. Nothing was broken, nothing overtly threatening had occurred. And yet, the presence was unmistakable, deliberate, aware, and intelligent. Emma realized she had entered a silent dialogue with the apartment. Every subtle shift, every whisper, every movement was part of a communication she could not fully interpret. She could only observe, respond, and adapt. The presence did not need to strike to terrify. Its awareness alone was enough to keep her on edge, to heighten her senses, and to challenge her perception of reality. Sleep became a delicate exercise in coexistence. She learned to anticipate disturbances, noting patterns, listening for floorboard creaks, monitoring Milo's instincts. Over time, she adapted, understanding that the apartment's intelligence was patient and precise. It did not seek harm, it simply existed, aware and demanding recognition. Consider the subtle forms of horror, the intelligence that observes, the patience that tests boundaries, the quiet insistence of an unseen presence. Sometimes the most terrifying experiences are those that exist quietly, deliberately, and intelligently in the spaces you call home. By the end of Section 3, Emma understood a profound truth. Horror is not always sudden or violent. It can be subtle, intelligent, and patient. It exists quietly, deliberately, testing your perception, measuring your awareness, and insisting on acknowledgement. Milo remained her guide, vigilant, intuitive, and attuned to the apartment's moods. Together they had adapted to a fragile coexistence, navigating the delicate balance between observation and fear. And yet, deep in her mind, Emma knew this was only the beginning. The uninvited presence had made itself undeniably known. It had acknowledged her, tested her, and communicated through silence, shadows, and subtle movements. Patience, vigilance, and careful observation would be required in the nights to come, as the apartment's intelligence continued to challenge her perception of reality. Morning light filtered through Emma's curtains, casting long, muted shadows across her apartment. The disturbances had slowed somewhat, though their presence remained palpable. Milo stretched lazily on the sofa, yet his ears twitched at the faintest creak, tail flicking occasionally, alert to movements invisible to human eyes. Emma sipped her coffee, notebook open on the table, recording her observations from the night before. The apartment had become a space of constant awareness, a silent, intelligent presence that tested her perception, patience, and adaptability. She reflected on the past weeks. What had begun as subtle, almost imperceptible disturbances, shadows, creaks, shifting objects, had grown into deliberate, patient demonstrations of intelligence. The apartment had made itself known without malice, without violence, and yet it had instilled a persistent unease. The awareness alone had changed her, altering her perception of space, sound, and even her own presence within the apartment. Emma understood that fear had transformed into cautious vigilance. She moved deliberately through the apartment, adjusting objects to anticipate subtle shifts, monitoring shadows, and noting every faint disturbance. Milo's instincts guided her, signaling subtle changes she could not yet perceive. The apartment had become a teacher of patience and observation, a reminder that horror is not always sudden, loud, or violent. Sometimes it is quiet, deliberate, and intelligent. At night, sleep remained tentative and shallow. Every creak, every shift of air, every soft rustle caused her to awaken immediately. And yet, the tension had become familiar, almost predictable. Emma had learned the apartment's rhythm, the timing of disturbances, the subtle cues that signaled observation. She had adapted, discovering a delicate equilibrium between vigilance and coexistence. Imagine being in her place, sharing a space with an unseen intelligence that communicates subtly, patiently, and deliberately. How would you adjust your behavior, your perception of safety, your awareness of every movement around you? Over the weeks, Emma noticed that the apartment's disturbances had a pattern of acknowledgement. Objects shifted when she focused on them, shadows elongated in synchrony with her gaze, and faint whispers, always deliberate, never threatening, responded to her awareness. Milo remained her guide, intuitively reacting to disturbances before Emma could perceive them. Together they navigated a cautious coexistence with an unseen presence, learning the subtle rules of engagement in a home that was alive in ways she could not fully explain. Emma began to reflect on the psychological impact of her experiences. She realized that horror is often not in the immediate threat, but in the patient intelligence of what observes silently, deliberately, and unrelentingly. Fear transformed into heightened perception, and vigilance became a way of life. She understood that some presences do not need to strike to instill dread. Their awareness alone is enough to command attention, reshape behavior, and occupy the mind. She documented every detail meticulously, the time of disturbances, the alignment of objects, the subtle movements of shadows, Milo's reactions. Patterns emerged, revealing a silent communication, a form of acknowledgement that required observation, patience, and respect. The apartment was not hostile, it was intelligent, patient, and deliberate, and it demanded recognition of its presence. Emma sometimes wondered if the apartment had always been aware, quietly observing its inhabitants, waiting for someone perceptive enough to notice. Perhaps it tested other tenants, or perhaps it existed simply to observe. Either way, the lessons she learned were clear. Awareness is key, patience is essential, and subtle intelligence can be far more unnerving than overt malice. Consider the spaces around you, the quiet corners, the shadows that linger, the subtle shifts in air and sound. Could there be awareness you do not perceive? How would you react if you knew something intelligent, patient, and unseen shared your space? Life in the apartment had transformed Emma. She had become attuned to subtle shifts, to movements of shadows, to air currents, to Milo's instinct. Her fear had evolved into observation, her vigilance a necessary adaptation. Sleep was brief, tension remained, but she had found a fragile peace. The apartment's presence was no longer only a source of anxiety. It was a constant teacher, shaping perception and patience, commanding respect without a single overt action. The subtle horrors had not ended. They would continue quietly, deliberately, patiently. But Emma had learned to coexist with awareness, recognizing that some entities, forces, or presences do not need to act aggressively to make their intelligence known. Their quiet persistence, their deliberate observation, and their patient acknowledgement are enough to change a person's perception of home, space, and reality itself. By the end of her reflection, Emma had come to accept an essential truth. Horror is not always violent. It can exist quietly, intelligently, and deliberately, transforming ordinary spaces into arenas of awareness and subtle tension. Milo remained her constant companion, attuned to the apartment's moods, guiding her with instincts she could not ignore. Together, they navigated coexistence with a presence that demanded recognition, patience, and respect. And yet, as she sipped the last of her coffee, listening to the faint hum of the city and the occasional floorboard creak, she understood another truth. Some presences, patient and intelligent, never leave entirely. They linger in the quiet corners, in the shadows, in the subtle shifts of air. And the most terrifying lessons are often those that teach you vigilance, observation, and the awareness that some horrors exist quietly deliberately, and beyond human comprehension. Emma closed her notebook, Milo stretching lazily at her feet. The apartment was calm for now, yet she knew it was always aware. She had learned to observe, to anticipate, and to coexist. True horror, she realized, is not something you defeat or escape. It is something you acknowledge, respect, and live alongside, aware, vigilant, and patient. And so, with the faintest shiver of unease still lingering in the air, Emma prepared for the night, knowing that the uninvited presence would continue to test her, silently, deliberately, and patiently. Emma's apartment was quiet now, almost serene, yet the awareness of unseen eyes lingered in every corner. Shadows shifted just slightly, floorboards groaned faintly, and Milo, ever vigilant, remained alert to disturbances invisible to the human eye. She had learned to coexist with the uninvited presence, patient, intelligent, and deliberate. And though the nights had grown more predictable, the lessons of vigilance, observation, and awareness remained. The world outside her apartment carried on oblivious to such quiet horrors, and yet, in other homes, other spaces, there were similar presences, subtle, intelligent, patient, waiting for someone perceptive enough to notice. These forces did not announce themselves with screams or violence. They existed quietly, deliberately, observing and testing the boundaries of those who entered their domain. As you listen, perhaps in the stillness of your own home, consider this. What would you do if you sensed a quiet presence watching, patient and deliberate, yet never fully revealing itself? Could you coexist, or would the unease take hold? Tonight, our next story begins elsewhere. In a neighborhood much like any other, yet hiding events that defy explanation. A home that seemed ordinary at first, yet became a stage for something beyond comprehension. Keep your senses alert, for some horrors do not need to shout. They simply exist, and those who notice are forever changed. Step carefully with me now into another tale of true horror, where ordinary spaces transform into arenas of suspense, and the unseen waits patiently, intelligently, and deliberately. David had always enjoyed solitude. A quiet, 35-year-old librarian, he had moved to a small apartment on the 5th floor of a century-old building in the city. The kind of building that carried stories in its walls, whispered histories in every floorboard, and bore the subtle weight of lives long gone. David's apartment was modest, a single bedroom with high ceilings, wooden floors that groaned with age, and a small balcony overlooking the street below. The space had been empty for months before he moved in, and he relished the calm, the rhythm of his days undisturbed by neighbors or noise. His routine was comforting, almost sacred. Mornings began with the quiet of dawn, filtered through lace curtains, and a cup of black coffee. He would read or write quietly in his journal before heading to the library for his shifts. Evenings were spent cooking simple meals, sketching small illustrations inspired by his days, or sitting on the balcony listening to the city breathe below. The apartment was a sanctuary, a place where he could retreat from the chaos of the world, find order, and indulge in the solace of routine. It was a Tuesday evening when the first subtle disturbance occurred. David had just returned from the library carrying a bag of groceries when he noticed it, a soft thud, barely audible, coming from the living room. His first thought was that a bag or box had shifted while he carried his groceries. Yet, as he stepped inside, everything appeared in place. The apartment was undisturbed, serene, as if the sound had been a figment of his imagination. Shrugging it off, David put away his groceries and prepared dinner. Milo, a stray cat he occasionally fed outside, had disappeared for the evening, leaving the apartment unusually quiet. And yet there remained a lingering sensation, subtle and unnerving, that he was not entirely alone. That night, as he read in his living room, David heard it again. Faint footsteps, soft and deliberate, moving across the floorboards in the hallway outside his bedroom. He froze, listening intently. The sound stopped as suddenly as it had started. He called out softly, "Hello, is someone there?" Only silence answered. Rational thought suggested an overactive imagination, perhaps the creaks of an old building settling. Yet there was something undeniably precise about the sound, the measured rhythm, the timing, the weight of each step. It was almost deliberate, as if someone or something had consciously chosen when to make its presence known. Imagine being in David's shoes, the quiet of your home disrupted by subtle, deliberate sounds you cannot explain. How would it feel to sense a presence without seeing it, to hear footsteps when no one should be there? Over the following nights, the occurrences became more noticeable, though never violent. A book would be slightly out of place on the shelf, a chair nudged an inch from where he had left it, a faint draft that felt like it followed him wherever he moved. David began documenting each event, noting times, positions of objects, and the subtle noises that woke him from sleep. Patterns emerged. Most disturbances occurred between 11 p.m. and 3 a.m., precise and deliberate, as if someone were observing his routines and testing his awareness. His sleep grew lighter, fragmented, the soft hum of the radiator, the distant traffic, and every floorboard creak becoming amplified in his mind. He moved cautiously, adjusting his environment preemptively, attempting to anticipate the subtle disturbances. Milo remained absent, and the silence of the apartment became almost suffocating. On a particularly cold Thursday, David returned from the library to find a note on his kitchen counter. It was small, handwritten, in a script he did not recognize. "I see you." His hands shook as he picked up the paper. There was no signature, no indication of who might have left it. Every rational explanation faltered. The building had been mostly empty for weeks. No neighbors had access to his apartment. The apartment itself, the walls, the floors, the very air, seemed to hum with quiet intelligence. The note was not just a message, it was acknowledgement, deliberate, patient, and unnerving. Determined to understand, David began to investigate. He checked the locks, examined the windows, reviewed security footage of the building's lobby and entrances. No one had entered. No one could have. Yet the presence persisted, subtle and deliberate, moving objects, creating noises, leaving signs. Never aggressive, but undeniably intelligent. Nights became exercises in vigilance. He placed cameras in the living room, bedroom, and hallway. He documented every anomaly meticulously. A pencil would roll from the edge of the desk to the floor. A floorboard would creak in a specific rhythm. Shadows shifted subtly along the walls. The apartment had become aware of him, responsive, patient, deliberate. And David was keenly conscious that every action of his own was now under observation. Consider your own home, the quiet corners, the creaks of floors, the subtle shifts in shadows. How would you feel knowing that your movements are being observed, your environment responding, intelligent and deliberate, even if unseen? One night, David decided to push the boundaries. He left his bedroom, walking slowly to the center of the living room, and spoke aloud. "I know you are here. I see you. I am not afraid." Silence. For several long minutes nothing happened. Then a single pencil rolled from his desk to the floor. Deliberate, precise. Milo, finally appearing at the window ledge, hissed quietly, ears flattened. The apartment had acknowledged him. It was not violent, not aggressive, but intelligent, aware, and deliberate. David realized he was part of a silent dialogue. Every subtle shift, every whisper of air, every deliberate movement of objects was communication. He could not see the tenant, the presence, the intelligence, but he could feel it. It had claimed its space, acknowledged his awareness, and tested his perception of reality. Days turned into a week of careful coexistence. David adjusted his routines, placing objects deliberately, monitoring shadows, and noting Milo's instinctive reactions. The disturbances had rhythm, a patient intelligence that demanded recognition. Fear had shifted into cautious respect, observation, and adaptation. The apartment had become a teacher, challenging him to notice, to respond, and to acknowledge an unseen presence that refused to be ignored. And yet, a lingering unease remained. The presence was patient, precise, and deliberate. It had made itself known, but it would not relent. Its quiet intelligence was enough to unsettle him, to heighten his senses, and to remind him that horror often exists in subtle observation, in deliberate awareness, rather than in overt violence. By the end of Section 1, David understood a profound truth. Some horrors do not need to strike. They exist quietly, deliberately, intelligently. They observe, they test, and they communicate subtly. The apartment, the building, the very space he inhabited, was alive in ways he could not fully comprehend. Milo remained vigilant, an instinctive guide in a world now filled with deliberate, patient awareness. And as David sat in the dim glow of his lamp, the soft hum of the city outside and the faint creak of the floor beneath him, he knew this was only the beginning. The silent tenant had made itself known, but its intentions remained hidden. And he would need patience, vigilance, and careful observation to navigate the nights ahead. Days had merged into nights in a blur of heightened awareness. David had become attuned to every subtle sound in the apartment. The faint groan of floorboards, the whisper of wind through the balcony, the distant hum of the city. Milo, ever alert, followed him closely, ears twitching, tail flicking, always sensing what David could not yet perceive. The presence, patient and deliberate, continued to make itself known through subtle movements, soft whispers, and the occasional displaced object. One evening, after returning from the library, David noticed an unnerving change. The small vase on his kitchen counter, which he always positioned perfectly, had shifted slightly. Not enough to be alarming at first glance, but deliberate enough to make him pause. Milo hissed at the corner of the room, fur bristling. David froze. His rational mind raced for explanations, a draft, vibration from passing traffic, or a settling building. Yet the subtle precision of the movement suggested something else, something aware, deliberate, and intelligent. That night he attempted to sleep, keeping the bedroom door slightly ajar and the lamp on at a low glow. Around 1:48 a.m., he awoke to a faint, rhythmic creak, like footsteps moving deliberately across the hallway outside his bedroom. Milo bolted upright, tail lashing, ears flat. David whispered softly, "I see you, I know you're there." But only silence answered. The awareness of being observed settled heavily over him. Every breath, every movement seemed to ripple through the apartment, drawing attention from an unseen intelligence that watched patiently, deliberately. Over the next few nights, the disturbances grew bolder, though still subtle. A book slid slightly off its shelf. Pencils on his desk aligned differently than he had placed them. Shadows in the living room shifted in a way that seemed purposeful. David's sense of safety eroded slowly, replaced by vigilant observation, anticipation, and unease. Sleep became brief and fragmented, the quiet of the apartment now filled with unseen activity that demanded attention. Imagine your own home suddenly feeling alive, aware of your every action, responding subtly, intelligently, deliberately. How would you cope with the sensation that you are being observed, tested, and acknowledged by something unseen? One particularly cold and silent night, David decided to set up a meticulous array of cameras throughout the apartment: living room, bedroom, hallway, even near the balcony. Milo remained by his side, an instinctive guide in a world now charged with awareness. He wanted evidence, proof of what he could not see but felt intensely, and perhaps a way to understand the intelligence behind these subtle disturbances. At 2:37 a.m., the apartment made its presence undeniably clear. A small sketchbook David had placed carefully on his desk shifted inches to the side. A pencil rolled away from the jar. Milo hissed, eyes fixed on the far corner of the room, where nothing appeared visible. David froze. The air itself seemed heavier, charged with intent. It was deliberate, intelligent, and impossible to ignore. Determined to confront the presence in a controlled manner, David stood in the center of the living room, speaking aloud in a calm, steady voice. "I see you. I know you are here. I am not afraid." Silence answered at first. Then a faint movement. A chair shifted slightly forward, the sketchbook tilted at an impossible angle, a pencil rolled across the desk with precision. Milo bolted under the table, ears flat, tail flicking. The apartment had acknowledged him, responding deliberately, patiently, and intelligently. David realized that the silent tenant was not malevolent, at least not in a violent sense. Its intelligence was subtle, patient, and deliberate. It observed, tested, and responded, but never attacked. The unease it caused was psychological. A persistent, quiet pressure that heightened his awareness, challenged his perception, and forced him to notice what he had long ignored: the intelligence and intention hidden within ordinary spaces. Consider the concept of a space that observes, responds, and communicates without being seen. How would your perception of home, safety, and routine change if intelligence existed in the shadows, deliberate, patient, and aware of your every action? Days turned into a week of heightened vigilance. David adapted to the apartment's rhythm, noting patterns, anticipating disturbances, and observing Milo's instincts as a guide to unseen activity. He placed objects intentionally, leaving them in positions that seemed to provoke subtle reactions. The disturbances followed a rhythm, deliberate, intelligent, and precise. A silent communication he was only beginning to interpret. One night, at 3:14 a.m., a particularly unnerving event occurred. David had left the kitchen for the living room. When he returned moments later, he found a note on the counter. Small, handwritten, entirely unrecognizable. "You notice, you adapt, we observe." His hands trembled. The apartment had communicated. Deliberate, precise, intelligent. There was no signature, no evidence of entry, no plausible explanation. David understood that this presence did not need to be seen to communicate. Its intelligence was in the subtle disturbances, the shifts in objects, the rhythmic creaks of floorboards, and the quiet acknowledgement that he was being observed. The following nights brought similar events. Objects moved, shadows shifted, and faint whispers, almost inaudible, brushed his awareness. Milo remained alert at all times, guiding David through the invisible landscape of the apartment's intelligence. Sleep became more tactical than restorative. Every creak, every subtle movement, every whisper demanded attention, requiring him to adapt and coexist with a presence that refused to be ignored. David began to understand the subtle forms of horror: intelligence, patience, and observation. True terror did not require violence. It could exist quietly, deliberately, in a space that responded to your awareness and measured your perception. The apartment, the building, and its silent tenant had become a teacher, forcing him to recognize that some forces in life do not act with aggression. They exist to observe, to test, and to acknowledge. Imagine coexisting with something unseen yet intelligent, patient, and deliberate. How would it change the way you inhabit your space, perceive reality, and respond to the ordinary objects and sounds around you? By the end of Section 2, David had adapted to the apartment's subtle intelligence. Fear had become awareness, vigilance had become routine, and every disturbance, every creak, and every shadow held meaning. The silent tenant had revealed itself not through violence, but through deliberate, patient, and intelligent interaction. Milo remained his constant companion, attuned to subtle shifts in air, shadow, and movement. Together they navigated a coexistence with a presence that was patient, intelligent, and persistent. David understood that the apartment had changed him, heightening perception, sharpening awareness, and teaching the quiet, deliberate lessons of a horror that did not strike but existed, intelligent, patient, and unseen. And yet, deep in his mind, David knew that this was only the beginning. The disturbances would continue, the subtle intelligence would persist, and the silent tenant would remain a patient, deliberate presence in his life. His challenge was not to defeat it, but to observe, adapt, and coexist. A lesson in awareness, patience, and the subtle forms of true horror. David had learned to live with subtle disturbances, yet the apartment's awareness seemed to grow stronger, more deliberate, and impossibly precise. Shadows shifted along the walls, responding to his gaze. Pencils rolled just as he turned his attention away. Floorboards groaned with intention, almost like measured footsteps pacing him. Milo, ever vigilant, had grown restless, pacing, ears flattened, tail lashing at corners where nothing appeared visible. One particularly cold evening, around 2:21 a.m., David returned home from the library to find an unusual stillness. The usual subtle creaks, whispers, and minor shifts of objects were absent. It was a silence that carried its own weight, the kind of quiet that heralds attention, waiting, and awareness. Milo froze in the center of the living room, ears twitching sharply, his gaze fixed on the far corner of the room. As David moved toward the kitchen, he noticed the subtle signs immediately. A pencil had rolled from his desk onto the floor, aligned precisely toward the door. A notebook on the coffee table had shifted an inch, deliberate, unhurried, and precise. The apartment's intelligence had become undeniable. It was aware, responsive, and testing boundaries. David's pulse quickened. This was no longer subtle observation. It was measured acknowledgement. He whispered softly, almost to himself, "I know you are here. I see you. I am not afraid." The air thickened. Milo hissed softly, crouched low, eyes unblinking, tail twitching in tension. And then, the first unmistakable sign. A chair slid slowly across the floor, its movement deliberate, calculated, almost in rhythm with David's breathing. Imagine being in his place, the subtle acknowledgement of presence, intelligence, and intent, expressed through silent movements, objects, and shadows. How would your mind react when awareness alone becomes threatening? David's rational mind raced. No one had access to the apartment. No one could have entered. Yet the disturbances were deliberate, precise, and intelligent. They responded to his attention, his movements, and even his thoughts, it seemed. The apartment had become an entity, patient, deliberate, and observant, with an intelligence that transcended ordinary understanding. That night, he decided to document everything meticulously. Cameras captured shadows that shifted subtly, books nudged slightly, pencils aligned differently, and the rhythmic creaks of floorboards in spaces where no human could be. Milo's reactions provided context, signaling disturbances that David could barely perceive. The apartment's intelligence was deliberate, patient, and responsive, and it seemed to be communicating through subtle acts rather than words. Around 3:03 a.m., David experienced the first direct acknowledgement beyond movement. He had placed a small sketchbook on the coffee table and moved to the balcony. Moments later, he returned to find the sketchbook open to a page he had never used, blank, yet containing precise, unfamiliar markings that seemed almost like a code. Milo hissed at the far corner, fur bristling, signaling presence. The apartment had left a message, deliberate, calculated, and entirely unseen. His heart pounded. Rational explanations failed. The intelligence in the apartment was undeniable. It had communicated through objects, movement, and subtle impressions, not physically, but psychologically, through awareness, observation, and patient acknowledgement. Imagine perceiving intelligence in objects, shadows, and air itself. A silent presence communicating beyond comprehension. How would you respond when your home itself becomes aware, deliberate, and patient? The following nights escalated further. Books would shift in alignment while he slept. Shadows pulled deliberately in corners. A faint whisper, almost unintelligible, brushed the edge of perception. Notice, respond, observe. Milo's behavior intensified. Fur bristled, tail flicked, ears pivoted to subtle sounds beyond David's comprehension. Objects moved in response to attention. A pencil, a notebook, a chair, all subtly repositioned. David realized he was in an active dialogue, forced to perceive, respond, and adapt. The apartment's intelligence did not strike with aggression. It commanded presence, awareness, and respect through quiet, deliberate actions. On one night, David chose to confront the apartment directly. He positioned himself in the center of the living room, spoke aloud in calm, steady tones. "I see you. I know you are here. I am not afraid. Show me your presence." For several long minutes, nothing happened. Then, subtly at first, the floorboards creaked rhythmically, objects shifted slightly, shadows stretched unnaturally toward him. Milo hissed sharply, crouched low, tail flicking. A chair slowly slid closer to the center of the room. A pencil rolled along the floor toward him. The apartment had responded, deliberately, intelligently, acknowledging his awareness. Consider the courage it takes to confront intelligence that cannot be seen. What would you do when every subtle movement, every whisper of air, every shift in shadow is a deliberate acknowledgement of your presence? The realization hit David with quiet terror. The apartment did not need to strike to assert dominance. Its intelligence was subtle, patient, deliberate, and relentless. The fear it instilled was psychological, an acute awareness of being observed, measured, and acknowledged without recourse. Sleep became tactical. David monitored every sound, every shadow, every subtle shift of objects. Milo provided instinctive guidance, alerting him to nuances beyond perception. Disturbances followed rhythm, pattern, and intention. The apartment was alive with quiet intelligence, teaching vigilance, patience, and acute perception through deliberate, subtle action. David began documenting the sequence of events, noting the precise timing of disturbances, Milo's reactions, and the subtle changes in object placement. He realized that horror was not in sudden violence, but in patient, deliberate awareness. The apartment's intelligence tested him, not to harm, but to observe, to communicate, and to ensure that he recognized its presence. Over time, he adapted. His fear shifted to heightened awareness. Objects, shadows, floorboards, and whispers became instruments of silent dialogue. Milo remained his constant companion, attuned to the intelligence in the space, guiding him through disturbances. Imagine learning to coexist with intelligence that observes silently, communicates subtly, and commands awareness without aggression. How would that reshape your understanding of your home, your perception of reality, and your ability to respond? By the end of Section 3, David had reached a fragile equilibrium. He had confronted the intelligence directly, acknowledged its presence, and adapted to its deliberate, patient actions. Fear remained, but it had evolved into vigilance. The apartment was no longer merely a space, it was a conscious, deliberate presence, testing perception, demanding awareness, and teaching quiet lessons about observation and adaptation. Milo curled at his feet, ears flicking at faint creaks. Shadows shifted in the corners of the room. Objects aligned differently than he had left them. The silent tenant remained patient, intelligent, and deliberate. And David understood, finally, that horror does not always strike. Sometimes it simply exists, quietly, deliberately, and aware, reshaping the mind of anyone who perceives it. And so, as the night lingered and the city hummed below, David prepared himself for the following nights, knowing that the silent tenant's deliberate intelligence would continue, testing, observing, and communicating in ways beyond ordinary comprehension. He was no longer merely a tenant. He had become part of the apartment's quiet, patient, and deliberate awareness. Morning light spilled through the lace curtains, painting the apartment in muted gold. David sat at the kitchen table, steaming cup of coffee in hand, notebook open before him. Milo stretched lazily on the sofa, ears flicking at subtle creaks and shifts in the apartment's quiet rhythm. The nights had grown long and tense, filled with deliberate, intelligent disturbances that had reshaped the way he perceived every sound, shadow, and object around him. Over the weeks, David had learned the patterns of the apartment. Disturbances followed a rhythm, subtle yet deliberate, precise yet patient. The pencil that rolled, the book that shifted, the faint whispers in the dead of night, all were part of an ongoing dialogue between him and the silent tenant. Fear had transformed into acute awareness, vigilance, and adaptation. The apartment's intelligence demanded attention, and David had risen to the challenge. He reflected on the lessons the apartment had taught him. Horror did not always need to strike violently to leave its mark. Sometimes it was quiet, patient, and deliberate. Its intelligence communicated without words, expressing itself through the alignment of objects, the rhythm of creaking floors, and the faint, precise whispers that brushed at the edge of perception. The apartment's presence was a constant, invisible teacher, reshaping his awareness of space, routine, and even time itself. Sleep remained fragmented, but it had become tactical. Every movement, every breath, and every glance required vigilance. Milo's instincts were crucial, guiding David through disturbances he could barely perceive. Together, they had formed a fragile alliance with the silent tenant, a coexistence born of understanding, respect, and patient observation. Imagine sharing a space with an unseen intelligence that observes, communicates, and responds deliberately. How would your perception of safety, routine, and reality shift in such a presence? One morning, David reviewed the security footage he had meticulously recorded over several nights. Shadows shifted in ways that defied physics. Objects moved subtly but deliberately, aligning with his attention. Every creak, whisper, and movement fit a pattern he was only beginning to understand. The apartment was not violent, but it was intelligent, aware, and persistent. A constant reminder that some presences do not need to be seen to make themselves known. David began to notice the subtle changes in himself. His awareness sharpened, instincts heightened. He observed details others might miss. The slight tilt of a picture frame, the gentle sway of curtains in a draftless room, the way Milo reacted to imperceptible movements in the shadows. The apartment's intelligence had forced him to perceive the world differently, to recognize patterns and to respect forces beyond ordinary comprehension. Over time, the disturbances decreased slightly, but they never ceased entirely. Objects still moved subtly, shadows shifted deliberately. and the faint whispers persisted. David accepted this as part of the apartment's presence, an ongoing reminder of its awareness and intelligence. He no longer feared it in the same way. Instead, he coexisted, observing and responding, adapting to a world in which awareness itself could be a form of terror. Milo remained ever vigilant, a silent guide and companion. His instincts were keen, reacting to the subtlest cues of the apartment's activity. David relied on him, understanding that some forms of intelligence and perception existed beyond human comprehension. Together they navigated coexistence, careful not to provoke, careful to acknowledge, careful to respect the silent tenant's deliberate presence. Consider the quiet forms of horror: intelligence that observes, patience that tests, and awareness that persists. How would your life change if you learned to coexist with a presence that communicates through subtle, deliberate action? David also reflected on the psychological impact of these experiences. The apartment had reshaped his understanding of fear, awareness, and adaptation. True horror, he realized, often exists not in violence or sudden shock, but in deliberate observation, patient testing, and subtle communication. The silent tenant had taught him vigilance, respect, and heightened perception. Lessons etched not in pain, but in awareness. Even in ordinary moments, the lingering presence was undeniable. Shadows held meaning. Objects aligned with intent. Floorboards creaked with intelligence. And yet, David had adapted. He understood that the silent tenant's intelligence was not malevolent. It was patient, deliberate, and aware. Its presence demanded acknowledgement, and he had risen to meet that challenge. In the quiet of the morning, David would sometimes sit on his balcony, looking out over the city, reflecting on the transformation of his perception. The apartment had forced him to notice, to observe, to adapt, and to coexist with an intelligence that defied explanation. Fear had evolved into awareness, vigilance had become a way of life, and the ordinary had become extraordinary in its subtle forms of communication. He sometimes wondered if other tenants in other apartments had ever perceived the same quiet intelligence. Perhaps some had ignored it. Perhaps some had succumbed to fear. David knew, however, that acknowledgement was key, a delicate balance between observation, respect, and coexistence. The apartment did not seek harm. It sought recognition, awareness, and deliberate engagement. Imagine living in a space that communicates without words, tests your perception, and insists on recognition. How would your awareness, patience, and understanding of fear evolve in response? As days turned into weeks, David's coexistence with the apartment became more natural. Objects continued to shift subtly, shadows moved deliberately, and faint whispers brushed at the edge of perception. Milo remained vigilant, ever aware of disturbances beyond David's senses. Together they had adapted to a fragile rhythm of awareness, observation, and acknowledgement. Yet, despite this fragile equilibrium, the silent tenant remained patient and deliberate. Its intelligence persisted, teaching quiet lessons in vigilance, perception, and adaptation. The apartment was alive in ways that defied comprehension, not violent, not overtly threatening, but undeniably intelligent. David had learned to respect it, to coexist with it, and to understand that horror could exist quietly, deliberately, and persistently within the spaces we call home. By the end of Section 4, David had reached a profound understanding. True horror is not always about violence, chaos, or fearsome apparitions. It can exist quietly, deliberately, and intelligently, reshaping perception, instilling awareness, and teaching vigilance. The silent tenant had made its presence known without malice, leaving David forever altered, attuned to subtle cues, respectful of intelligence beyond comprehension, and aware that the ordinary can be extraordinary when observed carefully. And as he sipped the last of his coffee, Milo curled at his feet, shadows shifting softly around the apartment, David accepted the lingering truth. Some presences never leave entirely. They persist in subtle movements, whispers, shadows, and the deliberate alignment of objects, teaching lessons in patience, observation, and coexistence. The silent tenant was not gone. It had become a quiet part of his life, a persistent intelligence shaping perception, and a reminder that true horror can exist quietly, deliberately, and beyond human comprehension. And so our journey through the shadows comes to an end. For now. You've walked alongside Kieran, witnessed the unseen intelligence of spaces, and felt the lingering presence of souls long forgotten. Each story reminds us that horror is not always loud, not always violent. Sometimes it simply waits, watches, and exists quietly in the corners of our world. Perhaps tonight, as you sit in the quiet of your room, you'll notice shadows stretching a little differently, hear whispers at the edge of hearing, or feel the presence of something unseen just beyond your perception. Remember, the stories we've shared are based on true experiences, real events that left a mark on those who lived through them. And maybe, just maybe, some of those presences are closer than you think. If you felt a chill, if a whisper made you pause, or if your imagination raced at any moment, comment below and let me know where you're listening from. Share your thoughts. Did one of these stories feel closer to home than the others? Your experiences might just be part of the Minute 60 community of listeners who dare to face the dark. Thank you for listening tonight. Make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications if you haven't yet, so you won't miss the next journey into the shadows. Until then, keep your lights dim, your mind alert, and remember, some presences never truly leave. This has been Minute 60, your companion in the quiet, chilling, and true stories of horror. Good night, and sleep carefully.